Let's turn to another critically important issue, and one that actually does, in fact, involve the Trump administration quite a bit, and that is the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and I guess the possibility that it could end relatively soon, which is what a lot of people are talking about. Critical minerals, there's a lot of different pieces to it. So to sort through all of this, we are very, very honored to be joined once again by Glenn Diesen, who's a professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway and the author of The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Glenn, thanks so much for being back with us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me back on.
No, well, very, very happy to have you. And I guess here's where maybe I will start is, do you have some level of hope that the United States and Russia can negotiate an end to the war? I mean, it seems obviously, the Europeans are hemming and hawing. Zelensky at least claiming that he won't sign anything that he doesn't participate in. But it does seem like the principles in some ways are the U.S. and Russia. So do you feel recent negotiations give us cause for hope, or perhaps, we should wait a little bit more to see how it pans out?
No, I think it's good reasons to be optimistic. Indeed, just the rhetoric coming now from the Trump administration, despite all its faults, I think it's been quite rational on many of these issues, and I think the key point here is if you want a peace, one have to address how the war began. But the Biden administration and most of the Europeans, they more or less refuse it. They lock themselves into this idea that Putin is the new Hitler. So I think if you want a peace, you have to realize what started the war. And the war started with NATO toppling the government in Ukraine in 2014 and pushing for expansion. Now, for the Russians, this was always unacceptable, and this is considered an existential threat. So that's why they invaded as well. They want to impose a neutrality on Ukraine, and this is necessary to get an end to the war. So the fact that Trump now comes along and says NATO is off the table, this is what started the war. This is a bit shocking to the Russians because they never heard anyone in the West wanting to recognize any of their security concerns. This is a wider problem we have in the West, by the way. They don't recognize security concerns of any of our opponents. But the fact that Trump has now said there will be no NATO expansion, it's unrealistic to get all the territories back, and there will be no security guarantees from the US. This, I think, has been the foundation of what a peace agreement has to include. So I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic.
Yeah, Glenn, it's super interesting also to just watch Trump attack Zelensky specifically, demand Ukraine's resources. We'll see, I guess, how that turns out. It's also just been interesting to see someone like Marco Rubio, who was a huge, huge anti-Russia hawk, be the one having to go around and sell this. Just coming from him, it looks strange, I guess, but that's where we are today. But you also, I think it's important to also note something that you argue is that the U.S. is now pivoting away from Europe and seeking this end to the war in Ukraine to actually weaken the Russia-China alliance. It's part of that pivot to Asia. So I'm curious, what signs do you see that Washington is perhaps shifting its priorities? And how might this impact both the war in Ukraine, but also this global sort of geopolitical shift to focus solely on the war with China?
Yeah, well, I understand and I don't disagree with the main thought behind this, because after the Cold War, the United States imposed this or pushed this security strategy based on global dominance. That is, it should dominate every corner of the world, which meant that it wouldn't have to take into consideration the security concerns of other great powers, simply because no one could even be in a position to challenge the US. I think, interestingly, Marco Rubio was the one who said in an interview with Megyn Kelly that this order has come to an end. The entire post-Cold War order. That is, the world is multipolar now, so you have many centers of power, and if the US continues to try to be dominant in every part of the world, then it will exhaust all its resources, and the main great powers will balance the United States. That is, they will all come together to put a big check on the US. So this is not in America's interest. So I think it's a good idea for the US to adjust to the realities of the new world. And what this means is it has to have some priorities above others. The US now appears to prioritize the Western Hemisphere, as we've seen with Trump's bit, I guess, aggressive approach to their own backyard, and also shifting more towards Asia. But a key region which is not a priority is Europe. you want to pivot to Asia, you have to pivot away from somewhere. And again, that is Europe. So if you want to get out of Europe, you also have to get out of Ukraine. So a lot of this makes sense. I'm not quite comfortable with this taking the natural resource of the Ukrainians in the weakest time. But the overall strategic picture of what they're trying to do, it's a good idea. I think the world is no longer Eurocentric. It's then indeed the Europeans, yeah, they're becoming largely more and more irrelevant. And so I think this is yeah, it's a necessary push away. It's just usually Trump colors it with his very bombastic language, and it results in many people focusing on his, I guess, unusual personality and a bit vulgar, yeah, vulgar language. But the strategic idea behind it does make a lot of sense.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of the Europeans being relatively irrelevant, because I wonder what you make of this this idea of European troops in Ukraine as quote unquote peacekeepers. I mean, I know Trump is saying that now from his conversations with Putin that maybe the Russians have some level of comfort with that. But I mean, it seems, you know, just sort of technically and logistically not that feasible. I mean, politically, whatever it may be. And I wonder how real you think that is, or how much you think that's an attempt by various EU nations to just stay in the conversation about what the final outcome will be here.
Yeah, they want to be involved, but also the Europeans want to be involved in order to sabotage the peace. And I think it's been quite evident by what they're pushing, because not only do they want to be a part of the conversation, but they're very explicit that they want these security guarantees. Now, security guarantees sounds wonderful. And indeed, I can understand the insecurity of Ukraine, why they would want a guarantee, even to deter Russia. But security guarantees is also something that would pull in the Europeans and then potentially also the United States if conflict would start again. Now, this is the worst thing you want in a peace agreement, one which creates incentive for restarting the conflict. That is, if Ukraine wants its territories back, all it has to do is restart the conflict, and then it will have the Europeans and Americans on its side, which could escalate quickly into a nuclear war. So I think this is a very bad deal. I think also Trump understands this. Now, what the Europeans want, though, they want as Macron said in his meeting with Trump, they would like, yes, a ceasefire, and then we can start to discuss the political settlement. And but I think this is also nonsense, because we've done this before in the Minsk agreement of 2015, which lasted until 2022. We did the same. We had a ceasefire, and then we're going to implement the political settlement. But instead of implementing it, the Europeans and Americans just pumped in a lot of weapons into Ukraine, built a large Ukrainian army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And by changing realities on the ground, they never had to implement the political settlement. So the main two negotiators and guarantors of this deal, which were the French and the Germans, they even admitted that the Minsk agreement was just to buy time to build a Ukrainian army. So it's so to try to sell this back into with the Russians, that is that somehow now we're going to do the same thing, another Minsk agreement, where we just freeze the front line, and then the West's going to start to rebuild the Ukrainian army so we can fight the Russians again another day. It's simply not going to happen. So I think, yes, Starmer, Macron, they go to Trump, they bring out all their best flattery, how great he is, and yes, we want to come here and support you. But the way I see it, they're trying to poison the deal, which Trump has been trying to push forward.
I'm curious if you can talk a bit about the Europe angle here, in the sense that, you know, you had the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago, and I mean, I still can't get over the fact that the head of the conference actually started to weep on stage as he was expressing how horrible it is the U.S. is stepping back from Europe. It just seems that, you know, even as the U.S. wants to kind of step away from Europe after forcing it, essentially forcing it, into this militarization of NATO, further militarizing itself, provoking this war with Russia and Ukraine, blowing up that pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline that totally screwed over to the Germans. I mean, and on and on and on. Essentially, you know, using Ukrainians as cannon fodder against the Russians. After all of that, the Europeans are sitting there begging the U.S. to continue. It's just kind of a sad thing to watch. But, you know, what does it mean about the future of Europe and how the U.S. sees Europe and whether it has any actual sovereignty?
Yeah, no, these are all good points. This was the United States who initially pushed for this hegemonic order, which entails expanding NATO and ignoring Russian security concerns. This is what started these tensions to begin with in 2008, which is when the seeds of the Ukraine conflict began by promising future NATO membership for Ukraine. The Europeans, they thought this was a disaster. Again, the German chancellor said this would interpreted by Moscow as a declaration of war, but still they bended a bit to Bush's demands at that time, and yeah, set us on a path to conflict with Russia. And again, I find it a bit interesting that Trump now portrays that America has done enough to help, but again, the United States was very key in toppling the government in Ukraine in 2014. It was the one who started this intelligence operations. That is, the CIA went in on the first day after the coup and set up this covert wars against the Russians. They're the one who supported sabotaging the Minsk agreement for 7 years, then sabotaged the Istanbul negotiations in 22. So for it to now come back and say, well, we did everything we could. This is Europe's problem. It's I can understand why the Europeans would feel a bit betrayed on this. But this being said, the Europeans, at least in the past, they used to, during the Iraq War, they were able to stand up to the United States sometimes when they thought the US was too aggressive. But since then, the Europeans have been quite spineless. But now we see suddenly the Europeans are building up courage to stand up against the US, apparently, but because the US wants to end the war. So you now have the new incoming German government who wants to form a closer partnership with the French and the British so they can collectively try to prolong the war in Ukraine. So it's a strange time to, you know, wanting to to challenge the US, but it's no, it's just extraordinary that that they want this war to continue to begin with, because this war is making the EU so incredibly irrelevant, as you said. When there's this much security dependence on the United States, the US can convert this security dependence into demands for political and economic loyalties. They can blow up Europe's entire energy infrastructure, and the German president gave a medal to Biden, which is extraordinary. They had all this. Sanctions, if you will. No, not sanctions, subsidies to transfer all these German industries over to the US. So, and again, they did nothing, and now they put themselves in a very, very vulnerable position.
I'm wondering how you think the issue of Zelensky's leadership could impact the possibility of signing an agreement. I mean, obviously, the Russians have raised the issue that they don't view him as totally legitimate because of the pushback he gave to Trump. Trump has also been undermining him. I mean, it seems like polls are shifting. There's some other candidates who seem to have some popularity. I mean, do you think that some sort of election or some sort of other leadership transition will be a required element of being able to reach a final solution, or if it's maybe more of an atmospheric issue?
No, I think it's probably necessary with a different leadership because, well, Zelensky, he kind of painted himself in a corner. He's been very adamant that he doesn't want to make a peace, and if it's too difficult, then the US and the Russians might prefer if he's replaced with someone else. If you see, for example, his former advisor, Alexei Arestovich, he's now a presidential candidate. If he takes power, he already said that this horrible deal on the table is the best deal Ukraine will get. And he's actually blaming the Europeans for not allowing Ukraine to end the war. So what I'm thinking, if Trump has a deal, and the Russians can agree to this deal and they're pushing it and Zelensky opposes it, then I think it makes sense to have to try to replace Zelensky with someone else. And given the fact that he's there now, his term has expired, it could open up for it. And then indeed in Ukraine as well, he is not very popular at all. So if there would be an election, he would be gone. Now, I'm not sure. I think also Zelensky's efforts to promise these minerals to Trump, it's a way of trying to elevate his own legitimacy. Keep in mind that Trump called him a dictator, which is, again, a way of saying that he's not legitimate. So Zelensky's been insisting that if they sign a deal with the US to hand over the minerals, Zelensky should be there to sign it with Trump. And this is a way of asserting his legitimacy in the United States. So I think the legitimacy issue is is a key problem. But it's also a good way to get around with Europeans, because if the Europeans try to create a hassle and not accept a peace agreement, then it would be much harder for the Europeans to oppose this if there is a president in Ukraine who also wants to accept the peace. Because at the moment, everyone seems to be on the same side. That is the United States, Russia, China, the majority of Ukrainians, all of them now wants a peace deal. It's just the Europeans standing on the sideline trying to sabotage it effectively. So if they can shift to Zelensky, they can also make the Europeans fall in line. So if I was Zelensky, I would start packing some suitcases at least in case there's time to leave very soon.
Yeah, I think that that certainly is probably the case. Well, a lot to watch and a lot to follow with this, and we will continue to do it. And we are very happy to have you with us to help us sort through it all. Glenn Diesen, professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway and author of The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Oh, thank you.